Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our 13th Salem Lit Fest. I'm Stephanie Buck, a member of the team of Salem Athenaeum staff and volunteers who bring you this festival each year. I'm very pleased to introduce our session, Fantastic Women of Fantasy Fiction. Before I introduce our authors, I want to give you a quick overview of how this will work. We've pasted our anti-harassment policy at the top of the chat, so you know the rules up front. We don't anticipate any problems from you book lovers, but we also want you to know how important it is to us that everyone feels safe. Most of you are Zoom experts by this point, so just a few quick tips. Please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them after the authors are done with their conversation. Any other comments can be put in the chat, though we'd appreciate you keeping chat to a minimum because it can distract our authors. If you'd like to use closed captioning, just click on the box that says CC at the bottom of your screen. And now our guests. Our moderator, Veronica G. Henry, is the author of Bacchanal, The Quarter Storm, and The Foreign Exchange, which is coming February 2023. Bacchanal was chosen as an Amazon editor's pick for Best African American Fantasy, and The Quarter Storm is a finalist for the Manly Wade Wellman Award. She is a viable Paradise alum and a member of SFWA. Her stories have appeared in FIYAH Literary Magazine. Liz Michalski is the author of Darling Girl and Evenfall. A reporter and editor, Liz now crafts articles on human interest, living, and health as a freelance writer. She lives with her family in Massachusetts, where she loves reading fairy tales and sometimes writing them. Jennifer Saint read classical studies at King's College due to a lifelong fascination with ancient Greek mythology. She spent the next 13 years as an English teacher, sharing a love of literature and creative writing with her students. She is the internationally best-selling author of Electra and Ariadne. Welcome, everyone, and I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Make sure everyone can hear me. All right, well, I am super excited to be here today and to have the opportunity to chat with such awesome and talented authors. That's kind of one of the things that I love most about participating in conventions and panels like this, is not only being introduced to great new books that I perhaps didn't know about and having the opportunity to read those, but just meeting the other authors and having the chance to have these types of conversations. So welcome, Jennifer, welcome, Liz. And I'll let you guys say hi first. You want
to? Hi.
Hello.
All right. Without further ado, then we'll go ahead and get started. One of the things that I like to hear most, and I think the audience would as well, is about the seed, right? Where the stories came from, where you got the idea, and what kind of compelled you from that idea to write this story at this time. Liz, why don't you go first and tell us about, perhaps what sparked you to write Darling Girl?
So I've always been a crazy, vivid dreamer, like insanely so. I was the kid whose mother had to check under all the beds because I woke up screaming and telling her that there were people there. And I had a crazy dream about a girl in Wendy Blue in the bottom of a stone turret hooked up to all these machines, and boys in Peter Pan green flying in and out saying, well, who's going to take care of us now? Who's going to save us now that she's dying? And I woke up and I thought, well, that's very creepy. And I reread Peter Pan, and then I really kind of went down the rabbit hole about J.M. Barrie and his life, which was, very sad and very dark. And it kind of came from there. And when I wrote Darling Girl, I wound up giving a draft to a friend and saying, would you mind taking a look and telling me what you thought? And she said, sure, what's it about? And I said, it's about Peter Pan. And she gave it back a few weeks later and she said, it is not about Peter Pan. And I was like, yes, it is. And she said, no, it's not. Take it home and figure it out. And I kind of shoved it under the bed and, stomped around for a while and regretted asking her. And then I went back and I read it and I thought, oh, she's right. It's really not about Peter Pan. It's about my oldest child getting ready to go off to college. And it's about how you feel as a parent watching this person that you've tried for 18 or 19 years to keep whole and keep safe, and having to let them go and having to let them go off and have their own adventures, and standing at the window watching them and not being able to keep them safe anymore. So that was the germ behind Darling Girl.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Jennifer, what about you
That was
and
so
Electra?
beautiful, Liz.
Mhm.
To say that, I think that sounds amazing. Electra came, I'd already written Ariadne, and Ariadne kind of had a connection to my children actually, which was that I decided to write about that particular woman because I'd been reading these Greek legends, this Greek mythology to my kids, and so much of it, when you're reading it through that kind of lens where they've been sort of, I think, kind of, sanitized and made palatable for children, they really focus on the heroes, on the men of the stories. And so for them, I was reading them Theseus and the Minotaur as it is. And it was actually my son who said, oh, what happened to Ariadne? Does she have another story? He was really interested to know what happened to her. And that really sparked me to go on and to write about her. But when it came to telling Electra's story and the other two narrators, because it is a three-part narration, there's Electra, there's her mother Clytemnestra, and there is Cassandra. And this was really because, as somebody fascinated by the classics, I was so very drawn to write about the Trojan War. I think that it's a subject that is just so full of endless fascination and tragedy and horror and darkness. And it tells us so much about the human spirit. But I didn't want to be on the battlefield with the heroes. I didn't want it to be a male-centered retelling of that story. I really wanted to focus on the women and the battles that the women were fighting in their own lives. And these are three women who really stood out to me as women who were very full of rage, which I think can be quite a difficult emotion sometimes for women to express or to be allowed to express, even to themselves. And these are three women who absolutely are able to do that, who do not feel afraid to take control of their anger and to direct it outwards and to try to use it to shape the society, shape the world that they think that they should be in. And so I liked the idea that I could take some women from Greek mythology who really did have some agency and some power, and whose actions perhaps are not always understandable or even sympathetic, but who really do make things happen.
That is awesome. Like you both, I think my work, actually both my novels, were inspired not only by other stories, but then certainly inspired by women and powerful women. My first novel, Bacchanal, the one that we're talking about today, actually, I'll go back. I'm a huge Ray Bradbury fan. And one of his novels, Something Wicked This Way Comes, is something that I read and reread years and years ago, when I first got the book. And at one point, at some time, I just picked it up again. And I probably started Bacchanal, I'm going to say over a decade ago. I picked it up again and I thought, well, what if I told this type of story from my perspective or from the perspective of someone who had my experience? And then, of course, I thought, just being a fan of history and historical novels, I thought that this was going to have to be set in the past. So I decided on the setting, right, a carnival, and then I decided on the time frame, then the location. With my family being from the South, I thought, well, it's going to be centered there, but perhaps as a carnival, it's going to travel across the South. So I wrote the first novel. And kind of just banged it out. I was a total pantser, no outline, no anything. And then I finished the book and read through it again. And I'm like, nope, this isn't it. This is not the story that I wanted to tell. And frankly, I don't know how to tell the story that I wanted to tell. So I did what any other author would do. And I put that one in the drawer and went on and wrote something else. And actually, the novel that I wrote, 2 novels after that, is my second novel, which is called The Quarter Storm. But that story continued to germinate in my head, and I continued to think about it. And I realized that I didn't want to abandon those characters. I did not want to abandon that story. And I was a better writer at that point. That something magical happens, with each book. You grow as a writer, you progress, your skill, your experiences, and all of those things you can weave back into the book. So I pulled Bacchanal back out and started working on it, and was also had the opportunity to work with in a mentorship program. So I got some help on the book and some critical feedback, and then went on the same journey, kind of just wrote it and said, okay, now I'm ready. This is the story that I definitely wanted to tell.
is your story? I after reading your book, at your end note, it's based. One of the characters is actually a real person. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Queenie.
without giving away too much of the plot, I had
Mhm.
never heard of her before. Can you talk a little bit about her and how you found her?
Oh, absolutely. She was, the interesting thing is, I think this was a story that I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. So the story of Queenie was one that we kind of just heard in the periphery. She was a character in probably 1930s Harlem. And she somehow or another, as a woman, found herself at the center of like a numbers running game and a bunch of other things that she did to kind of make money and survive. That's the thing about women, even back then. Women are great survivors, right? Even in a setting where we're not supposed to survive or where we're not supposed to be present in a certain situation, we always manage to find a way to do it and to thrive. But long story short, she kind of rose to the top of this organization, a numbers running organization, and had a whole crew. And it all kind of came to the end when I think the Italian mafia kind of edged in on her business and kind of pushed her out of it. But that is the story of Queen.
That was fascinating because I had never heard of her before. And
Yeah.
the other thing I found fascinating about your novel is I've read some Greek mythology and some of the Greek stories, but I've read a lot of English fairy tales and Celtic fairy tales,
Mhm.
but the characters that you drew on in your novel, in many cases, were unfamiliar to me. And again, without giving too much of your away of your story, you have the the um, the kind of the spirit animals that one of your main character
Mhm.
calls upon. Was that something that you had heard of before, or was it a story that you grew up with, or was it something that you made up or that you had to research? I was very interested in that.
Um, yeah, actually, it's part of African mythology, and I'll say particularly West African mythology. And I was that kid in a home with that was just filled with books. So all type of books, and like probably a lot of authors, maybe you both can relate to this. We pick up books that are not necessarily in our age range, and we kind of just dive in. So those were the kind of books that were around my household that I kind of grew up with. My father was very much a historian and very much interested in particular in West African history, and being able to kind of make that connection. So those were stories that I read about as a kid, and I think they kind of just stayed there, they germinated. And then later on, and when I decided to become an author, I sought out additional books and additional research and other sources to kind of dive in and learn a little bit more about. And one of the things that I found is that similar to the Native American tradition, a lot of West African tradition centers in that connection to not only animals, but to the environment, to the earth. So it was a concept that I saw around a lot of Native peoples. And I just thought, it was fascinating, and I wanted to explore it a little bit in my work.
Thank you.
Certainly. Let me then go to the next question I wanted to talk about is the journey. So tell me about the journey from idea, from germination to writing to publication and that whole process. Why don't you start, Jennifer?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's interesting that you've both talked about writing your novel and realizing it wasn't telling the story you wanted to tell, because I have exactly the same experience, and I think it's such a common process. And I think so often that can be discouraging to people, and they sort of think that's the moment to give up, and that's the moment to push forwards. That's the moment where you kind of uncover what that real story is. And certainly when it came to be writing Electra, I didn't start with the character of Electra at all. I found her utterly impenetrable, in fact, because I took Aeschylus's Oresteia as kind of my starting point for this novel, and that's a trilogy from classical Athens, which follows the story of it begins with Clytemnestra. So Clytemnestra is a wife of Agamemnon, who is the commander of the Greek forces, and he's going to take them to war against Troy. And Clytemnestra was really my way into this story, and it really began revolving around her, because she, in Greek mythology, she's notorious. She's very much kind of held up as this villain figure, and I found her immensely sympathetic as somebody who had been very much kind of, I felt, unfairly maligned as a terrible wife. Because while Agamemnon is away at war, she takes a lover, she takes control of his kingdom, and she plots her revenge against him. So I think you can say fair enough, she's not a great wife. But the point is that, like so many husbands of Greek mythology, he is far, far worse. And so I really found her the heart of the story, because Clytemnestra is a grieving mother. She has suffered the worst experience that I think as a mother, it's your worst nightmare, and she lives it. And so she was my way into the story. But as I was writing, I realized that there was this other voice kind of coming through in the story. And once I'd done my first draft, I realized, just like you have both said, that this isn't going to be Clytemnestra's story at all. There is somebody much more difficult, much more complicated, much more truly ancient in so many ways. And she's got a more compelling story to tell alongside it. And so it really took a huge amount of reworking. And you talked about being a pantser, which I'm really very much the opposite. I'm a plotter. And I found this very complicated because it spans this immense amount of time. It begins before Electra is born, back when Clytemnestra is getting married. It spans her entire lifetime, and several generations of the family, and it's being told from 3 different viewpoints. So for me, the process was a very kind of technical one in many ways of planning out these 3 separate arcs, these 3 separate timelines for my narrators, and putting it together and making it fit and realizing that it didn't. And so I found it very complicated to keep track of. And so I think that it was a novel that I felt I took apart and rebuilt over and over and over again to get to the final stage.
I can certainly sympathize. One of the things that was fascinating to me is how, just in this world that you created, how each of the 3 women reacted and how they managed to make a way for themselves in that world. And each was different, right? Can you talk a little bit about each of the 3 women and how they each managed to survive and thrive in the world that you created?
Yeah, that's very much that's what they have in common, these 3 women, isn't it? That they have to survive in a world that is very much built by men for the benefit of men, and they are caught up in this extremely male conflict, the Trojan War, which, if you read the Iliad, it's so testosterone fueled. It's so much about male rage, and like I said, I wanted to write about female rage and the way that is different. So for Clytemnestra, as I said, she is fueled so much by her grief as a mother. And I found that incredibly fascinating, the strength that it gives her, this kind of the way that she feeds off her own pain in order to survive. But the cost of that for Clytemnestra is how much of the rest of her that shuts down, because she is so consumed by grief for her daughter when Agamemnon sails to Troy, that she loses her relationship with her surviving children. That was something that really fascinated me about her in the mythology, that on the one hand, she is such an incredibly powerful maternal force, but on the other hand, she ends up caught in this terrible conflict with her own son and daughter. So the kind of, to bridge that gap, how on earth that happened was really interesting to me. But my other 2 women, I also have Cassandra, who is a priestess of Troy, because I so wanted to bring the Trojan perspective in. And I was writing this in 2020, I was writing it during lockdowns. And so to write from the point of view of a woman whose city is under siege, who cannot go outside, really did feel very resonant. You could find these parallels which is something that I love so much about mythology, when we look back into the past and we can see ourselves. And so for Cassandra, the obstacle that she faces is that she has been blessed with this gift from the god Apollo that she can see the future, and yet she is cursed at the same time by him that nobody will ever believe her. So she can see the oncoming annihilation of her city, but nobody will listen to her. And for Cassandra, I think she is really very much a contrast to Clytemnestra, in that Clytemnestra is fueled by this very kind of nihilistic grief and rage and despair. I think Cassandra cannot let go of that hope. And that is almost more destructive to her in the end, that she hopes that somehow she is going to be able to save Troy. And then finally, Electra, as I mentioned, I found her to be the most difficult of these three women to get into the head of. And I think that's because while Cassandra, we can see, well, she's a woman who she has very clear insight and knowledge, but people dismiss her as being hysterical and emotional. And I think there's not a woman alive who doesn't relate to that kind of being in that kind of position. Clytemnestra, like I said, we can see her as this woman who refuses to submit to male authority. She will not sit obediently and wait for her husband to return and resume control. She's going to take power. But Electra is a woman very much of an ancient mindset, that she wants to restore the status quo. And she is so much like her mother in so many ways, very driven, very determined. But the two of them come up against one another in this familiar mother-daughter conflict, but with very, very extreme repercussions, because neither of them are capable of seeing one another's point of view. They're just both so incredibly ferocious, incredibly uncompromising. And I found that trying to unlock Electra's mindset and what on earth makes her fight so hard to keep things the way that they were was really fascinating to me.
That is awesome. Go ahead, Liz. I know you want to pop in there.
I wanted to ask, was it difficult for you to make Electra sympathetic?
Yeah.
Because I have never found her a sympathetic character traditionally. But after reading, I was like, oh, like I can understand, I may not agree with her, but I understand why she went down this path. Was that a struggle for you at all?
Well, I'm so glad that you said that, because that was exactly where I wanted the reader to end up. And that's why I initially shied away from her, because I thought, how on earth can I make this? How on earth can I sympathize with her, let alone make anybody else? Because in Greek mythology, really, she's alone in having a passionate attachment to Agamemnon. Everyone despises Agamemnon. His own soldiers despise him, his wife despises him, but Electra is devoted to him. And I think part of the difficulty that we have with her as a character is, if we've read the tragedies, if we've read Aeschylus and then Sophocles and Euripides both wrote a tragedy, each entitled Electra, she comes into those plays a grown woman. So she's already fully formed. She despises her mother and she loves her father, and she's bent on this path, and she absolutely will not deviate from it. And so that makes her a brilliant character to see on stage, because she's so dramatic and she's so full of fire, and so incredible to see in driving the dynamic of a play. But in terms of understanding who she is, we really have to, I felt, I had to go back and see her as a child and see, well, what shaped her and twisted her and warped her, because that's the only way that we are ever going to understand and feel any degree of empathy towards her. And I kind of found my way into her in Euripides, who I think really did give us, of the Athenian playwrights, he really did give us these very nuanced and more complicated women who were really, who really did have multi-dimensional kind of characters. And in Euripides's portrayal of her, she's married off to a peasant, and the peasant, he's a farmer, but he has this great respect for Electra, and he never tries to take advantage of the situation, and he supports her in taking her revenge against her mother, which is what she wants to do. And so I thought, reading Euripides, he's given us somebody who cares about Electra, So there must be something to care about. So let's take this character, and I expanded his role and I brought him further back into her life, because that gives us another lens through which we can see her and through which we can understand a little bit more about what's shaping her. And really, like her mother, what's shaping her is trauma, is loss. It's the fact that her family was fractured and torn apart when she was a very young child. And although it was her father's fault, young children don't see things that clearly, and I think for when you imagine Electra in that situation, she must imagine, if my father comes home, everything will be okay. It's that very childish hope. And I think that enables us to see her as a more fully rounded individual.
Absolutely. And that kind of reminds me, Liz, of Holly, right? Again, as a mother, we got some really interesting mothers in this story. But when you look at Holly and the decision that she makes to take from one child to give to another, that's a complicated decision. I'd love to hear how you talk a little bit more about that decision that she makes and how she feels about what she's done.
I think for me, one of the fascinating things about Peter Pan is the way women are portrayed, because they're really not. For me, they're kind of stock characters. They're like figureheads that everybody else kind of bounces off of. Peter Pan has this great adventurous life. The Lost Boys, and even the pirates have all these kind of backstories. But we really don't know that much about Wendy, other than, she doesn't want to leave the nursery. She doesn't want to grow up. And the same with Mrs. Darling. And I was really fascinated by what it was like to be a mother in Peter Pan, specifically what it's like to be Mrs. Darling and lose your children and then have to stand at the window and watch as they go off again, because, at the end of the book, Peter Pan and Wendy strike this deal where she will come back every year to clean for him. And then Wendy kind of ages out, and her daughter is the one who goes off with Peter Pan. And I was fascinated by that, that decision to let them go. Why not just slam and lock the window, and say no. And I think I am really, at that point in time especially, I was particularly interested in how do you do that? How do you balance the needs of your children, and how do you balance the needs of yourself to parent in terms of holding them close, but not holding them too tightly. And I think that setting it a couple of generations away from Wendy gave me a little bit more freedom to play with that and to look at what parenting looked like in modern life. And I think that as a parent, you're always trying to balance the needs of your children if you have, more than one. It's Holly has an extreme version because it's literally life or death for both of her children, but it's constantly, how do you, be in two places at once? How are you at a baseball game and a soccer game? How do you afford to pay for ballet lessons and also, trumpet lessons? Who needs you more at a particular time, and who can kind of get by until you can get to them later on that evening? And I think that is just kind of the daily negotiation that most parents, particularly mothers, do. And it's not something that gets recognized, and it's not something that we talk about a lot. And we don't talk sometimes about the toll that takes on you as a person trying to juggle all those emotional needs. And no matter what you do, someone's going to be unhappy with you. The kid who was left 20 minutes cooling their heels in the principal's office because you're late for pickup is not going to be happy with you. And the person who has to, put off buying the new shoes for another week or two is not going to be happy with you. And it's a constant struggle to do the best you can with the resources that you have, and do them knowing that no one's ever going to be 100% happy with you.
Absolutely. Let's talk about side characters. I love the way that Jennifer talked about how she paired Electra with, pairing Electra with someone that could give us the ability to see her as more sympathetic. But if you can, think about another character, a side character in your story and talk a little bit about that character and just kind of what they meant to the story. Jennifer, if you wanted to start, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so I decided to kind of use Helen of Sparta, Helen of Troy, as people might know her, as a side character in the novel. And I have been asked sometimes, why not give her a perspective? Why not give her a narrative voice? I mean, partly, like I said, it was so complicated with three that I don't think I could have coped with another one. But it was a really conscious decision for me to sideline Helen. Because I felt so much that she is this huge focus of so much attention, and she means so many different things to so many different people. She's almost this kind of receptacle for everybody's opinion of her. And so I didn't want to make her central to this novel, because this novel almost had kind of a sister novel in the background. I don't know if you find this when you're writing, that there is kind of another story that you could tell, and you have to keep yourself on the path of, no, I'm going to tell this person's story, I'm going to follow this journey. And I felt that with Helen is the sister of Clytemnestra, and all of my characters have sisters. Electra's sister Iphigenia sets a great deal in motion as well, rather like Helen does. These are two women who are caught in the crossfire of the Trojan War and who spark these terrible events of history and mythology without necessarily intending to or meaning to, but very much bearing the brunt of the blame and the punishment for it. And so I really didn't want to put Helen in the spotlight. I really didn't want to put her back in the firing line. I wanted to have her as a character who related to Clytemnestra as a sister, because the other thing about Helen is that she is very much a focus of men's desire and men's anger. And so I wanted to see her as a sister to Clytemnestra, and when she comes to Troy, a friend to Cassandra, because that enriches our understanding of those characters, and it gives us a way to see them that is not just through the eyes of the men in their lives. Because I think so many times, like you talked about, Liz, the women in Peter Pan, the female characters being these kind of stock characters. I think when we see female characters portrayed in these stories, only in relation to the boys and the men that they are interacting with, that they matter to, and we only see Helen in so often in terms of what value she has because she's beautiful and because she's desirable, then we just lose so much of who they could be and who they are. So I always think it's so important to have these little illuminating moments where these characters relate to other people, be they friends or sisters, other kinds of relationships that are not male-female relationships.
Outstanding. Liz, do you want to pop in with the character that you wanted to tell us a little bit more about?
Yeah, and I love what you said. I think that's so true about, developing female characters outside of the male gaze. For me, that character is Jane, who's very much a love her or hate her character for a lot of my readers. She is the only original darling to really appear. And I chose to use her because I feel, for me, there's a side love story in my book, but for me, the love story is really between the mothers and the daughters, and the mothers and the children. And Jane allowed me to show Holly in a different light. Holly is a mother who's struggling with her children, but she's also somebody's daughter. And it was really fun to kind of write that part where she has an argument with her son and she's rolling her eyes, and then her mother comes in and tells her, everything she's doing wrong. And she's like, I just can't win. But also I wanted to show that the way that we relate to each other as parents and children changes throughout the years, right? I mean, we don't, discipline our kids the way our parents disciplined us. We don't have the same type of relationship sometimes that previous generations might have had with their offspring. But the love, is still there. It still carries through. It just takes a different form. And Jane is from an era, I kind of think of her as like the Downton Abbey era, or the Queen Elizabeth era, where she's very stiff, she's very proper, and that's how she was raised, and that's how she was brought up, and that's how she raised Holly. And Holly is a more contemporary mother, but even though they still, even though they have many, many differences, their bottom line is still the same. Their core goal is to, keep their children safe, to make them happy, and they both will do anything to accomplish that goal. So they kind of, were great foils to play off of each other for me.
That's awesome. It's interesting. One of the characters that I wanted to bring up is also a mother. So my main character is not a mom. But again, without giving away too much, we know that children are at the heart of my story. So the character that I thought most about was Hope. And Hope is a best friend to Liza, who's the main character. Hope and her husband, for reasons, decided to leave their child with her mom, and they're part of this traveling carnival. And one of the difficult parts of the story is, they develop a very easy and early friendship, and provide that sort of sisterly support to each other that's so important in a world, again, that's dominated by men, and especially in a time period where it wasn't even safe, perhaps, to be on your own as a woman. But later on, Hope has to make a decision that's going to not only challenge, but damage that friendship. And we get to see a little bit of the result of that betrayal. But she made the decision as a mother. She did what she thought was best for her child, even though it was going to have impact on the friendship. So I think just looking at the complexities, as you both have mentioned, about the decisions that mothers have to make, the balance with themselves and with the rest of their families and everyone around. I think it's just very interesting to see how we each tackled motherhood, I think, in our stories and all the complexities of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Totally. One of the other things that I wanted to ask, because I know we're getting a little bit low on time, is I think all of us as authors go into writing just for ourselves, right? We come up with these stories and we're telling the story because it's a story that we want to hear. But at the end of the day, when you release that book out into the world, you want it to have some sort of impact on the readers and on your audience. Jennifer, if you could kick us off by talking about what it is that you want people to take away from your novel, take away from the story. And yeah, let's just start there.
Yeah, and so I think that in writing a story that this time I think does encompass some familiar events to people, even people who are not kind of deep down the Greek mythology rabbit hole. A lot of people are familiar with sort of events surrounding the Trojan War. It's really, really well known. And so I think what I wanted people to take away from reading my interpretation of it was the way that these events really change, really turn on their heads when you view them through these other eyes and through this other lens, from this other perspective, and how those kind of big headline stories are sometimes not the most interesting ones, and sometimes are not the ones with the most kind of insight into our humanity. And that to kind of take these women who have all three of them been so very much villainized and kind of dismissed in a lot of older tellings of these stories. I think I just wanted people to be able to see really what's driving these women, and to understand where they're coming from, and to realize that there is something else that Greek mythology can offer us, and that actually there are some more interesting stories hidden underneath. And I think that it's always so important to me to be giving the women their voice and to be giving them a chance to tell their side of the story, because I think there are so many girls and young women who love Greek mythology and who deserve to see themselves in the stories, and not just as, like I said, a terrible wife or a hysterical woman or whatever other archetype we might have available to us, but to see them as fully realized, flawed, complicated, interesting women who are at the heart of their own stories.
Excellent. Very well said. Liz, what about you?
I think for me, I love reading. So one of the rides that I love most at Disney World is the Peter Pan ride, and I have always loved it. I can remember I was very nearsighted as a child, and we didn't find that out until I was in like fourth grade. And I went and did the ride, And as a, very nearsighted first or second grader, it looks so real to me. Like flying over Neverland, it looked like I was looking down. And I have such vivid memories of that, of seeing the pirate ship and seeing the Lost Boys and seeing Wendy. And, we went back a couple of years later. We were fortunate enough to go back, and I had glasses, and it wasn't real anymore. It didn't look the same. And I think about that with fairy tales is when you read them as a child, you get that shiver up your spine, and it's, you're looking under your bed and you're checking behind the curtains for shadows. And then when you read them again as an adult, you can appreciate them, but it's not the same. And one of the things I missed about reading Peter Pan was just that shiver of excitement and anticipation, and the fingers of fear that run up your spine. And that's what I try and do when I write. I try and put that magic and that darkness in a setting for adults, so that hopefully when people read it, they get a little bit of that same experience that they lost as children, that they can't recapture, that maybe they can find in adult, fairy tale fiction.
Excellent. I can tell you both, mission accomplished. And again, very, very excited that I got a chance to read both your stories. I will very quickly say that for me, what I hope that people gain from reading my work is the complexities of families, the complexities, families real, biological, and then those chosen families as well. My character starts out being very angry at her parents for making a decision that she doesn't understand at the time. But that later on, through the events of the story, she comes to understand they did what they did to try to protect her. So I think it's a story that challenges us to look at our own assumptions, to challenge those, to look at how we judge our parents, and to challenge those assumptions as well. And to also understand that family is complicated, and that people, as I think it was Jennifer that said, we're flawed. But at the heart of it, is love. And I will close there. I know that Stephanie's popped in, so that means it is time for Q&A.
It is time for Q&A. Thank you all so much. This was an excellent conversation. So first question from the audience is, how do you write a strong woman main character without emasculating male characters?
Ooh.
And this is open to everyone.
And that's such a good question, and not one that I've been asked at all. But I would say that, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. So I don't think that in writing strong female characters that we are making them masculine in any way. I think we've all talked quite a lot about the kind of what our stories, although they're very different kind of in their settings, we've all written about mothers. And I think that there is such a great strength and power in motherhood, that there is a feminine strength. And so I don't think that necessarily when you are writing a strong female character that you are in any way diminishing the male characters. Because I think that there is more than enough to go around. I think that sometimes it has been the case, and I know because I'm doing retellings, I'm always kind of considering the way that these myths have been told before, that the masculinity of the male characters has sometimes diminished the humanity and personhood of the female characters, because it shrinks them down to nothing but kind of a damsel to be saved, or a seductress, or a crone, or some kind of figure that isn't fully realized and fleshed out. But I think if you treat all of your characters with care and attention, then you are not kind of taking away from one when you build another, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that most, especially in retelling, most male characters have no problem holding their own. It's the female characters that tend to traditionally be diminished and tend to traditionally be overlooked. And I think that having strong female characters brings a whole other level of energy to the story, because the male characters, rather than having someone who is beneath them, have someone to actually play off with and interact with at a level that is much more engaging and much more enticing for me as a reader. than when the level is as unequal as it often is.
Absolutely. I think Liz and Jennifer already just gave excellent, eloquent responses to that. The only thing that I'd add is that I find true confidence in my male characters comes from not being intimidated or threatened by a strong female character. So I think just in terms of what Liz was saying about leveling the playing field, I just think it makes each of the characters rise more than diminish in any way.
Thank you, everyone. Next question is for Jennifer specifically. With 3 points of view, did you write and revise them individually and merge them, or keep the storyline intact and move back and forth between them?
So I did both. Oh, sorry,
Go
was there
right
more? Yeah, sorry, I think I had like a slight delay, so I wasn't sure if I missed something. But yeah, so I did both. So I wrote it in timeline order, so alternating my different characters' perspectives to kind of get the skeleton of the story. And then when I went back, and like I said, I did multiple drafts of this, but part of that process was then separating out each character's point of view. So I had printouts. Actually, I find it much easier to kind of work with hard copies, with paper copies rather than looking at it all on a screen. So I had kind of my Clytemnestra chapters all in one bundle, the Cassandra ones in another, the Electra ones in another. And that was a great way for me as well to see how I'd split the story between them and who needed more voice, who needed actually to be taking on more of the story, who was dominating. So that was really helpful in that way. But I would read them through separately to make sure that each of these women had a fully realized arc of their own, and then put them back together and then work on it as one complete draft and then take it apart again. So it really was doing it both ways repeatedly.
That sounds a lot like my knitting projects. You just put it together and take it apart again. I have another question for all of you. How much research did you do, and how complex was it for you?
I wound up doing a lot of research on J.M. Barrie because even though he's not a major character in my book, I really wanted to make sure I understood what I was doing in terms of Darling Girl and kind of elongating the threads that I found in Peter Pan. And I really wanted to know where some of that darkness came from and some of the unrest that I think is at the heart of that story that we may not see as children, but as adults going back is clearly there. So I read, everything I could find about him. And then I read a bunch of his other works as well.
I will say the research was extensive. I'm writing historical fiction, so I had to go back and understand so much about the climate of the 1930s. So you've got, environmental concerns, all of that was going on, during that time. So you've got the Great Depression, so you've got financial stuff going on, you've got the Dust Bowl, you've got, racial challenges and things like that going on. And then not only understanding that from the perspective of just the entire country, but centralizing that to the South. And then it's a traveling carnival. So I had to understand what was going on in each of the places where the carnival kind of touched down. What were the hot button items that were going on there? What was the climate like? What was law enforcement like? All those types of things. So and it was fun. I absolutely loved and adored researching that time period in America. And then you add in the, research for the mythology, West African history, along with African American history and how that was informed, because, we were a generation closer to the transatlantic slave trade. So all of that research kind of went into it. I loved every bit of it, and hopefully I didn't dump too much of it into the book.
Yeah, just like he said, when you're writing historical fiction, there's this kind of two strands. So I had the research into the mythology, the different existing versions, the way that people had taken on these characters and these events and stories before, and then the historical part of the research, which was slightly more difficult because, as I mentioned before, I was writing this in 2020, and so very much confined to home for most of that time. And so where ordinarily I would go to like the British Museum, for example, is such a rich resource for finding artifacts from the ancient world, because the Bronze Age is 3,000 years distant from us. What survives to us is largely in fragments and ruins and incomplete texts and all of these kind of missing pieces that you are trying to create an entire world from. And so I do find it really useful to be able to research visually as well as through reading information. I like to be able to go and see what we have remaining in terms of kind of textile and pottery and kind of real sort of existing objects that I find very grounding and very kind of gives us a connection. But that wasn't so possible. So a lot of that kind of visual research I did have to do online, which I think made it maybe slightly less enjoyable, but still I love to be immersed back into that world and to kind of to build it back around myself, I think is a really wonderful thing. And that was the joy in lockdown, was to be able to go to another world and to escape this one for a little while.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of the research that goes into novels like yours. I mean, because as a reader, you just are so fully immersed, and it's just such a wonderful experience. And I am going to wrap us up, as that was our last question that we have time for. So Veronica, Jennifer, and Liz, thank you so much for joining us. Up next, we have Monster Mash, Monstrosities in YA, and So You Want to Be a Mother, a discussion of motherhood in literature happening, and those are happening concurrently at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you to the Salem Athenaeum and to all of our sponsors. And lastly, thank you to our audience. If you are inclined, you can purchase our authors' books at Wicked Good Books here in Salem, Massachusetts, Copper Dog Books in Beverly, Massachusetts, or from your favorite local bookseller. Our festival is free for everyone each year and is possible due to your support. If you'd like to donate to the festival, please head to salemlitfest.org and click donate. Check out the rest of our authors at salemlitfest.org and enjoy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.